A murder confession emerges from a small Oregon town gripped by a 27-year mystery. The FBI profiler said this case would never be solved until a single Polaroid photo arrived in the mail. The evidence was there all along, hidden by the one person nobody suspected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The final leaves of autumn clung desperately to the maple trees lining Main Street in Pinecrest, Oregon, as Sheriff Maureen Calloway pulled her weathered Bronco into the station's gravel lot. The crisp October air carried the scent of woodsmoke and pine, familiar scents that had defined her 32 years in this sleepy logging town. But today, something felt different. A heaviness hung in the atmosphere, like the pressure before a storm. The morning sun barely crested the eastern ridgeline as Maureen climbed the worn steps of the sheriff's office, her boots leaving damp impressions on the wooden planks. She was earlier than usual, prompted by a restless night filled with fragmented dreams of a case that had haunted her since she was a rookie deputy. Inside, the station was quiet save for the hum of the ancient coffee maker and the gentle tapping of Deputy Wilson's fingers on his keyboard. He glanced up as the door swung shut behind her. "Morning, Sheriff." Wilson nodded, sliding a manila envelope across his desk. "This came for you yesterday afternoon. Courier service from Portland. Marked urgent." Maureen eyed the package warily, setting her travel mug down before picking it up. No return address, just her name written in precise block letters. Something about the handwriting stirred a memory she couldn't quite place. "Thanks, Ben." She tucked the envelope under her arm and headed to her office. The wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a space unchanged for decades: oak desk, mismatched filing cabinets, and walls covered with community notices, wanted posters, and a large map of Pinecrest County dotted with colored pins marking open cases. Her gaze lingered on a faded red pin near the center of the map: Riverton Bridge, July 16, 1995. Maureen settled into her chair, the familiar leather groaning beneath her weight. She flipped the envelope over in her hands, hesitating before breaking the seal with her thumb. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph and a handwritten note on lined paper. The photograph showed a young woman, smiling broadly at the camera, blonde hair swept up in a messy ponytail, standing on Riverton Bridge. The date stamp in the corner read July 16, 95. The last known photo of Catherine Mills, taken hours before her disappearance. Maureen's breath caught in her throat as she unfolded the note. 5 words, written in the same block letters as the envelope: "I know who killed her." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine Mills had been just 23 when she vanished during Pinecrest's annual summer festival. A local girl who'd returned after college, teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school. Beloved by students and parents alike, she had no enemies, no troubled past. Just a bright future suddenly and inexplicably extinguished. The investigation had consumed Maureen's early career. As a young deputy, she'd combed every inch of forest surrounding the bridge, interviewed every festival attendee, chased countless leads that evaporated like morning mist. The case had been her obsession until, eventually, the trail went cold, and life in Pinecrest reluctantly moved forward. But Maureen never forgot. Every July 16th, she placed fresh flowers at the memorial bench the town had erected near the bridge. Every Christmas, she visited Catherine's parents, who still kept their daughter's bedroom untouched, as if waiting for her return. And every night, she added to the case file notes, theories, connections too tenuous to pursue officially but too persistent to ignore. She studied the photo again, then flipped it over. On the back, scrawled in different handwriting, "Look at the reflection in the water." Maureen reached for her desk magnifier, holding the photograph under the glass. In the rippled surface of the river beneath the bridge, barely visible, was another figure. Someone standing just out of frame, watching Catherine from the shadows. Her phone rang, startling her from her concentration. It was the front desk. "Sheriff, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about the Mills case." Maureen's heart quickened. Name? Eleanor Winters. Says she used to live here. Moved away in '95. The name registered immediately. Eleanor Winters, Catherine's best friend since childhood. The last person to see her alive, according to statements from the original investigation. The person who had reported her missing when Catherine failed to meet her for the fireworks display that night. Send her in. Eleanor entered cautiously, a woman in her early 50s now, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines etched around her eyes that spoke of years carrying a heavy burden. She clutched a worn leather journal to her chest like armor. Maureen, she said softly. It's been a long time. 27 years, Maureen replied, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Please, sit. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair, her knuckles white against the journal's cover. I got your message. Maureen frowned. What message? The email. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Asking me to come. Saying it was about Kathy. I didn't send you any email, Eleanor. Their eyes met in shared confusion, then understanding dawned simultaneously. Someone had orchestrated this meeting, the same someone who had sent the photograph. Eleanor placed the journal on the desk between them. I've been carrying this for 27 years, Maureen. I think it's time. What is this? Maureen asked, though something in her already knew. Kathy's journal. She gave it to me the morning she disappeared. Asked me to keep it safe. Eleanor's voice trembled. I was afraid to read it then. Afraid of what I might find. But after I got that email, I finally did. Maureen opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with Catherine's flowing handwriting, documenting her daily life, her hopes, her fears. And in the final entries, a growing dread. The last entry, dated July 15, 1995, read, Meeting Jay, at the bridge tomorrow. He says he has proof. I'm scared, but I have to know. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the box at Cedar Point. Combination 7-16-8. Maureen looked up sharply. Cedar Point? Eleanor nodded. The old lookout. We used to hide treasures there as kids. There's a hollow in the biggest cedar tree, we called it our secret mailbox. And 7-16-8? Our birth months and the number of letters in forever. It was our secret code. Maureen stood abruptly, grabbing her jacket from the back of her chair. We need to go there. Now. The drive to Cedar Point was silent, both women lost in their thoughts as the Bronco climbed the winding mountain road. Ancient trees loomed on either side, casting long shadows across the pavement. Maureen's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle long abandoned. The lookout was unchanged, a small clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below, surrounded by towering cedar trees. Eleanor moved unerringly toward the largest one, her hands tracing the bark until she found a weathered knot at chest height. She pressed it, and a section of bark swung open like a small door, revealing a hollow space within. Inside was a metal cash box, rusted at the edges but intact. Eleanor stepped back, giving Maureen space as she carefully extracted it from its hiding place. The combination worked, 7-16-8, and the box opened with a reluctant creak. Inside lay a cassette tape labeled simply Evidence and a folded piece of paper. Maureen unfolded it to reveal a photocopied document, financial records from the Pinecrest Development Fund, dated June 1995, with several transactions highlighted in yellow. What is this? Eleanor whispered. Maureen studied the document, recognition slowly dawning. These are transfers to offshore accounts. Large sums. Her finger traced the signature at the bottom. Authorized by Mayor James Blackwood. Eleanor's face paled. James? But he was Catherine's fiancé, Maureen finished. And the son of the most powerful man in the county at the time. The cassette tape was their next priority. Back at the station, Maureen rummaged through storage until she found an old tape player. With Eleanor and Deputy Wilson gathered around her desk, she pressed play. Catherine's voice filled the room, clear and determined despite an undercurrent of fear. My name is Catherine Mills. It's July 10th, 1995. I'm recording this because I've discovered something that could destroy people I care about, but I can't stay silent. James has been moving money from the development fund, millions designated for the new hospital wing, into private accounts. His father knows. They're planning to blame it on accounting errors, claim the money was never there. But I have proof. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. I confronted James last night. He denied everything, then got angry when I showed him the copies I'd made. He said I didn't understand how things worked in this town, that his father had protected Pinecrest for 30 years and sometimes that meant making hard choices. He said no one would believe me over them anyway. Catherine's voice broke slightly. I'm meeting him at Riverton Bridge on the 16th. He says he wants to explain everything, make me understand. I don't know what to do. If anything happens to me, this is why. This is the truth. The tape clicked off, leaving the office in stunned silence. Maureen was the first to speak. James Blackwood left town a month after Catherine disappeared. His father claimed he was devastated, needed a fresh start. No one questioned it. What about the elder Blackwood? Wilson asked. Died of a heart attack in 2010. The family fortune mysteriously diminished in his final years. Maureen turned to Eleanor. Did you know about any of this? Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I knew she was troubled about something, but she wouldn't tell me what. Said it was better if I didn't know. The night she disappeared, she was supposed to meet me after seeing James, but she never showed up. I always assumed. She couldn't finish the sentence. Maureen's phone rang again. The front desk. Sheriff, there's a gentleman here insisting on seeing you. Says his name is Dr. Thomas Blackwood. The silence in the room thickened. James's younger brother, Maureen said, her mind racing. Send him back. Thomas Blackwood had the family's characteristic height and strong jawline, but where his father and brother had projected confidence bordering on arrogance, Thomas carried himself with a quiet intensity. His hands fidgeted with the strap of his messenger bag as he took in the scene before him, the open metal box, the tape player, Eleanor's tear-streaked face. I see I'm late, he said softly. You already found it. Maureen stood, positioning herself between this unexpected visitor and the evidence. Found what, exactly? Thomas met her gaze steadily. The truth about what my brother did. And how would you know about that, Dr. Blackwood? He set his messenger bag on the desk and withdrew an envelope identical to the one Maureen had received that morning. Because I'm the one who sent you the photograph. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension crackling like static electricity. Maureen nodded to Wilson, who quietly moved to block the door. Why now? Maureen asked. After all these years? Thomas sank into the chair Eleanor had vacated. Because my father is dead. Because James is dying, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And because I've spent 27 years keeping a secret that's eaten away at everything good in my life. He reached into the bag again, producing a thick file folder. I was 17 when it happened. Home from boarding school for the summer. I idolized James, he was everything I wasn't. Confident, popular, our father's clear favorite. His voice grew bitter. I followed him that night. I'd seen him arguing with Catherine earlier, heard enough to know she'd discovered something about the family business. I was curious, maybe jealous. I just wanted to see what was so important. Thomas opened the folder, revealing dozens of photographs. I was going through a photography phase. Had my camera with me everywhere. I was on the far bank, using a zoom lens. I saw, his voice caught. I saw James push her. They were arguing, and then suddenly she was falling. The splash. The way she didn't come back up. The photographs told the story in stark black and white, Catherine and James on the bridge, their body language tense, James's hand on Catherine's shoulder, Catherine falling backward, her expression one of shock more than fear, the splash in the water below, James looking down, then around, then running. Why didn't you come forward? Maureen asked, though she already knew the answer. I ran home, terrified. When I got there, James was already talking to our father. I heard enough to understand, it was an accident, he claimed. She'd threatened to expose the missing funds, they argued, she slipped. Or that's what he told our father. Thomas's hands trembled. Father said he'd take care of everything. Told James to pack, be ready to leave the country within the month. Then he saw me in the doorway. He made me swear I'd never tell. Said it would destroy our family, the town. Said no one would believe me anyway, the troubled younger son against the Blackwood name. Eleanor made a small, wounded sound. You let us believe she was still out there somewhere. You let us hope. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. I was a coward. But I did look for her. When Father sent me to medical school, I came back every break, searching the river downstream from the bridge. It took 3 years, but I finally found her. He pulled out one last photograph, a rock outcropping downriver where the current had wedged something against the stones. I couldn't retrieve her myself. Couldn't report it without exposing everything. So I called in an anonymous tip. But by then, the summer floods had come and gone, and there was nothing left to find when the search teams arrived. Maureen remembered that call, a male voice, giving precise coordinates, claiming to have seen something in the water. The subsequent search had yielded nothing, and they dismissed it as a hoax. And now? Maureen asked. Why come forward now? Because James confessed to me last week, Thomas said. Not an accident, he admitted he pushed her deliberately. She had copies of everything, was planning to take it all to the state police. Our father's empire would have crumbled. James couldn't let that happen. He looked directly at Maureen. He's in Portland, at Providence Medical Center. Doesn't have long. But he's lucid, and he's ready to confess. Maureen stood, gathering the evidence with methodical precision. Deputy Wilson, call Portland PD. Have them send officers to Providence Medical Center to secure James Blackwood until we arrive. Then contact the state police, we'll need their jurisdiction on this. Wilson nodded and stepped out, already reaching for his phone. Eleanor hadn't moved, her gaze fixed on Thomas. 27 years, she whispered. We buried an empty casket. Her parents died never knowing what happened to their daughter. I know, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But I can give her justice now. It's all I have left to offer. Maureen placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through the other woman's body. We'll find her, Eleanor. We'll bring her home. The next hours passed in a blur of activity, calls to the district attorney, coordination with state police, preparation of statements. By late afternoon, Maureen and a state police detective were on the road to Portland, the evidence secured in a lockbox between them. James Blackwood lay in the hospital bed, skin yellowed with jaundice, his once imposing frame withered by disease. When Maureen entered the room, his eyes tracked her movement with the remnants of his old calculation. Sheriff Calloway, he said, voice raspy. I wondered when Thomas would finally break. Your brother sent us the evidence, Mr. Blackwood, but you've been living on borrowed time for 27 years. A ghost of his former smile crossed his face. We all live on borrowed time, Sheriff. Mine's just more visibly running out. He gestured weakly to the chair beside the bed. You'll want my confession, I presume. For 2 hours, James Blackwood laid out the truth, the embezzlement scheme, Catherine's discovery, his desperation, the fateful meeting on the bridge, and the moment of rage that ended her life. He described how his father had orchestrated the cover-up, using the family's influence to steer the investigation away from them, and how they'd watched from a distance as the town gradually accepted that Catherine's disappearance would remain unsolved. She deserved better, Maureen said when he finished. James looked out the window, where twilight was settling over the city skyline. She did. But we don't always get what we deserve in this life, Sheriff. Sometimes we have to wait for the next one. He turned back to her. I can tell you where to find her. There's a cave system beneath the eastern bank of the river. The current pulls everything there eventually. That's where Thomas found her. That's where she'll still be. 2 days later, a specialized recovery team located Catherine's remains exactly where James had indicated. Dental records confirmed her identity. James Blackwood was formally charged with her murder from his hospital bed. He died 3 weeks later, never having faced a courtroom. In Pinecrest, the revelation shook the community to its core. Many remembered James as the golden boy, the hometown hero who'd left in grief. Others recalled how his father's influence had shaped the town for decades, how the promised hospital wing had mysteriously downsized after budget reassessments. Thomas Blackwood turned over all family assets to a victim compensation fund and disappeared from public life. Eleanor stayed in town long enough to see Catherine properly laid to rest, this time with real closure, before returning to her life elsewhere. For Maureen, the resolution of her first major case brought a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice delayed was justice diminished, but it was still justice. On the day after Catherine's second funeral, she removed the faded red pin from the map in her office, placing it in a small box with Catherine's case file, now stamped closed. That evening, she drove to Riverton Bridge alone. The summer festival was long past, the autumn leaves drifting down to dot the dark water below. She stood where Catherine had stood in that final Polaroid, looking out over the river that had kept her secret for nearly 3 decades. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said to the gathering darkness. "But you can rest now. We all can." As she turned to leave, a young deputy was approaching across the bridge, his face serious. "Sheriff," dispatch called. "There's been an incident at the old mill. They're requesting you specifically." Maureen nodded, duty calling her forward as it always had. Some cases ended. Others were just beginning. And in a town like Pinecrest, the truth always found its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. The morning after finding Catherine's remains, Maureen woke to the insistent buzzing of her phone. The caller ID displayed Portland Medical Examiner. She answered, voice still rough with sleep. "Sheriff Calloway. Dr. Amari here. I apologize for the early call, but there's something about the Mills case you need to see." Maureen sat up, instantly alert. "What is it?" "I'd rather not discuss over the phone." "How soon can you get to Portland?" 3 hours later, Maureen stood in the sterile confines of the medical examiner's office, the scent of antiseptic burning her nostrils. Dr. Amari, a petite woman with close-cropped gray hair and piercing eyes, laid out a series of photographs on the light table. "These are Catherine Mills' remains," she began, voice clinically detached. "As you can see, the preservation in the cave system was remarkable, limited exposure to elements, consistent cool temperatures, minimal scavenger access." Maureen nodded, steeling herself against the images. "You found something unexpected?" Dr. Amari pointed to a specific area in one photograph. "The hyoid bone. It's fractured." She moved to another image. "And here, finger-shaped bruising on the neck vertebrae, still visible even after all this time." Maureen's breath caught. She was strangled. Before she went into the water, yes. This wasn't a drowning, Sheriff. Catherine Mills was dead before she hit the river. The revelation landed like a physical blow. James Blackwood had confessed to pushing Catherine during an argument, claimed she'd fallen, that her death was unplanned if not entirely accidental. But this evidence told a different story. "There's more," Dr. Amari continued, pulling out another folder. "We found trace evidence under her fingernails. DNA was degraded, but we managed to get a partial profile." She slid a report across the table. "It doesn't match James Blackwood." Maureen stared at the report, mind racing. "Then whose DNA is it?" Dr. Amari's expression remained neutral. "We ran it through Cody's. No direct hits, but a familial match flagged. Someone related to James Blackwood." "Thomas?" The question formed automatically, though Maureen immediately doubted it. Thomas had been just a teenager, hardly the profile of someone capable of such calculated violence. The match suggests a closer relation than brother. Parent-child level compatibility. Maureen looked up sharply. Richard Blackwood? James and Thomas's father? Dr. Amari nodded. It's consistent with that level of relation, yes. But Richard Blackwood is dead. Yes, which is why we need a sample from Thomas for comparison. If it's not Richard's DNA, and it's not James's, there are limited possibilities remaining within that family structure. Maureen left the medical examiner's office with her certainty shattered. The case she thought closed was unraveling, revealing new depths of deception. James's confession now seemed a final act of protection, taking responsibility to shield someone else. But who? His father was the obvious answer, but Richard Blackwood had been in his 60s then, Catherine a fit young woman in her 20s. Could he have overpowered her? Back in her car, Maureen called Eleanor, who had delayed her departure from Pinecrest upon hearing the news. There's something I need to ask you, Maureen said once pleasantries were exchanged. In all the years you knew Catherine, did she ever mention any connection to Richard Blackwood beyond him being her future father-in-law? Eleanor's pause was telling. Why do you ask? Please, Eleanor. It's important. A long sigh filtered through the phone. Catherine worked part-time at Blackwood Industries during her senior year of college. Some kind of internship. She never talked much about it, just that she worked directly with Richard. When she came back to town after graduation, he was the one who helped her get the teaching job. Maureen's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Was there anything unusual about their relationship? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know if it means anything, but about a month before she disappeared, I went by her apartment unexpectedly. She was on the phone, arguing with someone. When she saw me, she hung up quickly, seemed flustered. Later, I saw a text on her phone when she went to the bathroom. It just said, "We need to talk. This has to end." Why didn't you mention this before? Because I asked her about it, and she said it was Richard calling about wedding plans, that he thought James was rushing things. It seemed plausible, everyone knew Richard was controlling of James's life. And when she disappeared, the police were so focused on her movements that day, not what happened weeks before. Maureen thanked Eleanor and ended the call, her mind churning with possibilities. A new narrative was forming, one where Catherine's discovery of the embezzlement scheme was only part of the story. She needed to find Thomas Blackwood. Thomas had returned to his Portland apartment after giving his statement, a modern high-rise overlooking the Willamette River. When Maureen knocked on his door that evening, he seemed unsurprised to see her. "You found something else," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. It wasn't a question. The apartment was sparsely furnished, more like a temporary residence than a home. Books lined the walls, but there were no personal photographs, no mementos. It was the space of someone who had never fully settled. The medical examiner found evidence that Catherine was strangled before entering the water, Maureen said, watching Thomas carefully. And DNA under her fingernails that doesn't match James. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his hands trembled slightly as he poured 2 glasses of water. "You think there was someone else involved?" "The DNA shows a familial match to the Blackwood line. Parent-child level compatibility." He set the glasses down, one sliding slightly across the counter. "My father. That's what the evidence suggests. But I need to rule out all possibilities. I need a DNA sample from you, Thomas." He nodded slowly. "Of course. Whatever you need." As Maureen prepared the cheek swab, Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the city lights reflecting off the river. "You know, I always wondered if there was more to the story. James was many things, but he wasn't violent, not physically, at least. When he told me he'd pushed her, it felt rehearsed. Like he'd practiced the confession." Maureen sealed the sample. "Did you ever suspect your father's involvement?" Thomas turned, his profile silhouetted against the glass. "My father was capable of anything to protect what he'd built. But Catherine? She was going to be family." He shook his head. Though maybe that's naive. My father's definition of protection could be distorted. How so? A bitter smile crossed Thomas's face. When I was 16, I got into some trouble, nothing serious, just teenage rebellion. My father's solution was to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for 6 months. Told everyone I was at a special academic program. Said it was for my own good. He controlled the narrative, Maureen observed. Always. In the Blackwood family, appearance was everything. Reality was flexible. Maureen left with the DNA sample and more questions than answers. Thomas's description of his father matched what she remembered of Richard Blackwood, a man of immense local power who crafted the town's perception with the precision of an artist. If Catherine had threatened that carefully constructed image, what might he have done? Back in Pinecrest the following day, Maureen pulled the original case files from storage, reviewing them with fresh eyes. Richard Blackwood had been interviewed multiple times during the initial investigation, his statements consistently supporting his son's alibi for the critical hours. They'd been together at the family lake house, discussing wedding plans. But there was a gap. Between 6:30 and 8:45 p.m., Richard claimed to have been making business calls in his study while James napped. No witnesses, no verification. Enough time to drive to Riverton Bridge, confront Catherine, and return before anyone noticed his absence. Maureen dug deeper into the Blackwood family history, requesting old financial records, property deeds, news clippings, anything that might illuminate the relationship between Richard and Catherine. What she found sent a chill through her core. Catherine's mother had worked as a housekeeper for the Blackwoods in the late 1960s, leaving their employment abruptly in 1971. 9 months later, Catherine was born. There was no father listed on the birth certificate. The implications were staggering. If Catherine was Richard's daughter, it would explain his involvement in her education, his help securing her job, perhaps even his initial support of her engagement to James, a way to keep her close, to maintain control. But what had changed? What had triggered the confrontation that ended with her death? Maureen needed one more piece of the puzzle. She drove to the county records office, requesting access to Blackwood Industries' corporate filings from 1995. Among the dense legal documents and financial statements was a proposed amendment to the company bylaws, drafted just weeks before Catherine's disappearance. It would have expanded shareholder rights, allowing non-family members with certain qualifications to receive voting shares. At the bottom of the document, 2 signatures, Richard Blackwood as CEO, and Catherine Mills as witnessing notary. The picture crystallized with terrible clarity. Catherine hadn't just discovered the embezzlement, she'd found proof of her parentage. The amended bylaws would have been Richard's way of acknowledging her, perhaps even bringing her into the family business officially. But something had gone wrong. Maureen called Thomas immediately. "Did you know Catherine was your half-sister?" The silence on the line stretched thin before Thomas finally answered. "I suspected. There were photos in my father's study, a young woman who looked like Catherine's mother. When I asked about her, he became uncharacteristically emotional. Said she was someone he'd failed. Why didn't you mention this?" "Because I wasn't certain, and it didn't seem relevant to James's confession. But now, with what you found, I need to know what happened that night, Thomas. The full truth." Another pause. "Come back to Portland. There's something I need to show you." Thomas's apartment felt different in daylight, the sparse furnishings more evident, the emptiness more pronounced. He led Maureen to a small home office where a laptop sat open on the desk. "After you left yesterday, I started going through old family records I'd digitized. Found this." He clicked open a video file. "Security footage from our lake house. My father had cameras installed everywhere, paranoid about corporate espionage. I downloaded all the archives years ago, looking for anything related to Catherine. Never found anything until now." The timestamp on the footage showed July 16, 1995, 7:13 p.m. Richard Blackwood's car pulling into the garage, him exiting quickly, moving toward the house with purpose. His sleeves were rolled up, and even in the grainy footage, dark stains were visible on his light-colored shirt. He disappeared inside, reappearing 18 minutes later in fresh clothes, the stained ones bundled in his arms as he moved to the outdoor fire pit. He was burning evidence, Maureen breathed. Thomas nodded grimly. And here's James, supposedly napping. He forwarded the footage, showing James arriving separately at 8:32 p.m., looking disheveled and frantic. A heated conversation ensued on the deck, Richard's body language dominant, James's increasingly submissive. James wasn't at the bridge, Maureen realized. He was covering for your father. And took that secret to his grave. Thomas closed the laptop. My brother was many things, but in the end, his loyalty to our father never wavered. The DNA results came back 3 days later, confirming their suspicions. The genetic material under Catherine's fingernails matched Richard Blackwood's profile, reconstructed from Thomas's sample and old medical records. The case that had begun as a tragic accident, then evolved into a calculated murder, now revealed itself as something even darker, a father killing his own daughter to preserve his secret and his empire. But proving it in court would be impossible. Richard was dead, James was dead, and the evidence, while compelling, was largely circumstantial. The legal case ended with James's deathbed confession, a partial truth that served as a shield for the complete one. For Maureen, though, the pursuit of truth transcended legal outcomes. She gathered Eleanor, Thomas, and a small group of those who had known Catherine best, sharing with them the full story as she had pieced it together. Catherine discovered she was Richard's daughter while working on the company bylaws, Maureen explained. She confronted him, perhaps threatened exposure. Richard, facing the collapse of both his public image and his family structure, met her at the bridge. The argument escalated. He strangled her, then staged it to look like she'd fallen. When James learned what his father had done, he agreed to take the blame if it ever came to light, Thomas added quietly. Not out of love for our father, I think, but out of shame for the family legacy. And perhaps to protect me from knowing the full truth. Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. So Kathy died because she wanted acknowledgement? Because she wanted the truth? She died because Richard Blackwood couldn't face the consequences of his actions, Maureen corrected gently. Because secrets and power were more important to him than his own daughter's life. The group dispersed, each carrying a piece of the burden that comes with knowing truths too painful to fully absorb. Only Thomas remained behind, looking lost in the aftermath of revelations that had rewritten his family history. What happens now? He asked. Maureen considered the question carefully. Justice, in its purest legal form, isn't possible anymore. But there are other kinds of justice, truth, remembrance, reparation. Thomas nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. The Blackwood fortune, what's left of it, I want to use it to establish a foundation in Catherine's name. Scholarships for young women pursuing careers in law or criminal justice. And funding for cold case investigations. He met Maureen's gaze. Would you help me set it up? You knew her case better than anyone. I would be honored, Maureen replied. 3 months later, on what would have been Catherine's 50th birthday, the Catherine Mills Foundation was officially launched at a small ceremony near Riverton Bridge. The site, once a place of tragedy, had been transformed into a peaceful memorial garden. At its center stood a stone bench inscribed with words Catherine had written in her journal, "Truth may bend to power for a time, but it never breaks." Eleanor, who had decided to stay in Pinecrest after all, laid a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the bench. She always loved lilies, she said softly. Said they reminded her that beauty can grow from the muddiest waters. Thomas stood slightly apart from the gathered crowd, his face solemn but peaceful. He had donated not only the Blackwood fortune but also the family's lakeside property, which was being converted into a retreat center for families affected by violent crime. As the ceremony concluded, Maureen found herself alone at the bridge railing, looking out over the water that had held Catherine's secret for so long. The river flowed on, indifferent to the human dramas that played out along its banks, carrying away the past while nourishing the present. Thomas joined her, his silence companionable. "Do you think she knows," he asked finally, "that the truth came out?" Maureen considered the question, watching the sunlight dance across the rippling surface below. "I believe truth has its own power. It exists whether we acknowledge it or not. Catherine fought for it in life. I like to think she found peace in it, whatever comes after." They stood together as twilight descended, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above. In Pinecrest, lights winked on in windows, families gathering around dinner tables, lives continuing in their steady rhythms. The town had been shaken by the revelations, but not broken. Like truth itself, it had bent under the weight of secrets but emerged stronger for having faced them. As Maureen drove back to the station that night, she thought about the nature of justice, how it sometimes arrived in unexpected forms, through unlikely messengers, long after hope had faded. Catherine's case had defined her career, shaped her understanding of power and its abuses. Now, it would shape the future of Pinecrest and beyond through the foundation bearing her name. In her office, Maureen opened her desk drawer and removed the faded red pin that had marked Catherine's case on her map for so many years. She held it in her palm, feeling its slight weight, so small to represent something that had loomed so large. Then she placed it in a small velvet box alongside a pressed white lily from the memorial garden. Not evidence anymore, but remembrance. Not a mystery, but a legacy. She closed the box and set it on her shelf, visible but no longer dominating the room. Outside her window, a light rain began to fall, washing the streets clean, nourishing the soil where new growth would emerge. In this small Oregon town where secrets had festered for decades, truth had finally taken root, a slow, quiet justice that would bear fruit for generations to come. Maureen turned off her desk lamp and prepared to leave, pausing at the doorway to look back at the office that had witnessed her 27-year quest. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to serve the communities she had sworn to protect. But tonight, at least, one long chapter had closed. And in that closure, there was peace. 6 months after the launch of the Catherine Mills Foundation, the first frost of winter glazed Pinecrest in silver. Maureen Calloway stood at her office window, watching morning light transform the town square into a crystalline wonderland. The chill in the air matched the one that had settled in her bones since closing Catherine's case. The truth had been revealed, the foundation established, Catherine properly laid to rest. Yet something felt unfinished. Like the final page of a book left unread. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Deputy Wilson entered, holding a courier envelope. "This just arrived for you, Sheriff." Hand-delivered from the State Crime Lab. Maureen took the package, noting the urgent stamp across its front. Inside was a single-page report and several photographs. The lab had continued analyzing evidence from Catherine's remains at her request, focusing on trace elements that might have been missed in the initial examination. What they found changed everything. Soil samples embedded in Catherine's clothing contained a unique mineral composition matching only one location in the county, not the riverbank where James claimed she'd fallen, nor the cave system where her body was ultimately found. Instead, it matched the grounds of an abandoned mining operation on the outskirts of town, a property that had been owned by Blackwood Industries until 1998. More troubling still were microscopic fabric fibers found under Catherine's fingernails alongside Richard Blackwood's DNA, fibers that didn't match any of her clothing or Richard's known wardrobe. They matched industrial uniform fabric, specifically the type used by Pinecrest's volunteer fire department in the 1990s. Maureen's mind raced. The volunteer fire chief during that period had been Victor Reeves, Richard Blackwood's closest friend and business associate. The same Victor Reeves who had led the initial search for Catherine, who had declared certain areas too dangerous to explore, who had personally coordinated with the county sheriff, Maureen's predecessor, to determine search parameters. She reached for her phone, dialing Thomas Blackwood's number. "Did your father have any connection to the old Holloway mine?" she asked without preamble when he answered. Thomas's hesitation was brief but telling. It was one of his first acquisitions, the property, not the mine itself. It had closed decades earlier. "Why?" "I think Catherine was killed there, not at the bridge." And I think Victor Reeves was involved. Another pause. Sheriff, Victor Reeves is still alive. He lives in the assisted living facility on Maple Street. Maureen hung up and grabbed her jacket, calling to Wilson as she headed for the door. I need you to pull everything we have on Victor Reeves and the old Holloway mine. And get me the visitor logs for Pinecrest Assisted Living for the past 6 months. Pinecrest Assisted Living Center sat on a gentle hill overlooking the town, its red brick facade and white columns giving it the appearance of an old money estate rather than a care facility. Maureen found Victor Reeves in the solarium, a withered figure in a wheelchair, his once powerful frame diminished by age and illness. At 86, Reeves still possessed the sharp blue eyes that had once commanded respect throughout the county. Those eyes narrowed as Maureen approached, recognition and weariness flashing across his weathered face. "Sheriff Calloway," he said, voice surprisingly strong. "Come to check on an old man?" Maureen pulled a chair close, sitting at eye level. "I'm here about Catherine Mills." Reeves's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the armrests of his wheelchair. "Terrible business. I heard they found her remains." "That Blackwood boy finally confessed, I understand." "James Blackwood confessed to a crime he didn't commit," Maureen said evenly. "And I think you know that, Victor." The old man's gaze shifted to the window, where bare branches swayed against a pewter sky. "I've been retired for 20 years, Sheriff. Ancient history doesn't interest me much anymore. It's not history when justice hasn't been served." Maureen leaned forward. "We found soil from the Holloway mine on Catherine's clothing. And fibers from a fire department uniform under her fingernails." For a moment, Reeves seemed to shrink further into his chair. Then he straightened, a ghost of his former authority reasserting itself. "You have theories, not proof. And even if you did, I'm dying, Sheriff. Pancreatic cancer. Same as James Blackwood. 3 months at most, the doctors say. Then you have nothing to lose by telling the truth." Reeves's laugh was brittle. "Truth is rarely simple, young woman. Especially in this town. Try me." The old man studied her face, seeming to measure her resolve. Finally, he sighed. "Not here. Too many years." He gestured to a nurse hovering nearby. "I'm allowed garden privileges. Weather permitting." Despite the cold, the garden was peaceful, dormant flower beds and leafless trees creating a stark landscape of patience and potential. They found a secluded bench in the shadow of an ancient oak, frost crunching beneath their feet. "Richard Blackwood was my oldest friend," Reeves began without preamble. "We grew up together, built our lives in this town together. When his wife couldn't have children, I was the one who suggested the surrogate arrangement with Maria Mills." Maureen's breath clouded the air between them. "Catherine's mother." Reeves nodded. "Maria was young, needed the money. Richard's wife never knew, thought the boys were miracles after years of trying. But Maria grew attached to the idea of her child, started making demands. Richard paid her off, sent her away. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 23 years later, Catherine Mills returns to Pinecrest. Smart girl, ambitious. Gets a job at the school, starts dating James Blackwood. Too many coincidences for Richard's comfort. He had me look into her background." The old man's eyes grew distant. "When we confirmed she was Maria's daughter, Richard panicked. Thought she'd come back for revenge, to expose the family secret." "Is that why she died? Because Richard thought she was a threat?" Reeves shook his head slowly. "It wasn't that simple. Richard became obsessed with her. Started finding ways to be around her, offering her jobs, advice. I think part of him wanted to acknowledge her. Another part was terrified of what that would mean for his family, his reputation." "What happened on July 16, 1995? Maureen pressed. "Richard asked to meet Catherine at the bridge, neutral ground, public enough to feel safe, private enough for a delicate conversation. He told me he was going to offer her a place in the company, a trust fund, but no public acknowledgement. I waited nearby, in case things went badly. Reeves closed his eyes. I heard her laugh. Not amused, bitter. She said she didn't want his money. She wanted him to tell his wife, tell the boys. Said she had a right to know her brothers. And Richard refused. He pleaded, then threatened. Catherine turned to leave. He grabbed her arm. She fought back, scratched his face. That's when I stepped in. The confession hung in the frosty air. I was just trying to restrain her, to calm things down. But she was fighting hard. I didn't mean to, his voice broke. By the time I realized how tightly I was holding her, she'd stopped struggling. Maureen's voice was steady despite her racing pulse. You killed her. An accident, Reeves insisted, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. Richard was hysterical. Said we had to hide her, that no one could ever know. We took her to the mine, abandoned, isolated, secure. Planned to bury her there, but the ground was too hard. We left her in an old office, locked the gates. Richard was supposed to return later with proper tools. But he didn't. There was a storm that night. Flash flooding. When Richard returned 2 days later, the lower tunnels were flooded. Catherine's body was gone, swept into the underground water system that feeds into the river. Reeves's hands trembled. We searched but couldn't find her. Richard was beside himself. Convinced we'd get caught. So you controlled the search, Maureen said. Used your position to steer investigators away from the mine, away from the river caves. Reeves nodded weakly. The official story was better for everyone. A young woman disappears without a trace. Tragic, mysterious, but eventually forgotten. If the truth came out, it would destroy too many lives, Richard's family, my family, the town that depended on Blackwood Industries. And James? When did he become involved? Years later. Richard was dying, needed to unburden himself. Told James everything. The boy was devastated, but loyal to the end. Promised that if the truth ever emerged, he'd take the blame. Protect his father's legacy, protect me. Reeves's eyes filled with tears. I never asked him to do that. Maureen sat in silence, absorbing the weight of these final revelations. Not one crime, but many. Not one betrayal, but a cascade that had flowed through generations. I need your formal statement, she said finally. All of it, recorded and signed. Reeves looked suddenly exhausted, the confession draining what little energy he had left. And then what? You'll arrest a dying old man? Parade me through town in handcuffs? Justice isn't about punishment, Victor. It's about truth. Catherine deserves that much. The following day, in a private room at the Assisted Living Center with Thomas Blackwood and Eleanor present as witnesses, Victor Reeves gave his full statement. His voice grew weaker as the hours passed, as if the truth, so long contained, was depleting his remaining strength as it escaped. When it was done, Maureen filed formal charges: manslaughter, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. But as Reeves had predicted, his declining health made traditional prosecution impossible. Instead, she arranged for a unique form of resolution. 1 week later, in the town hall where generations of Pinecrest residents had gathered to celebrate milestones and mourn tragedies, Victor Reeves appeared via video link from his hospital bed. The room was packed, families who had lived through the mystery of Catherine's disappearance, younger residents who had grown up with it as local legend, reporters from surrounding counties drawn by the promise of closure to a case that had haunted the region for nearly 3 decades. Maureen stood at the podium, her uniform pressed, her expression solemn. 27 years ago, this community lost one of its brightest lights. Today, we finally hear the full truth about what happened to Catherine Mills. She stepped aside, and Victor Reeves's face filled the screen, gaunt, shadowed with pain, but clear-eyed. He spoke for 30 minutes, his confession unsparing in its detail, unflinching in its admission of guilt. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute, a collective breath held by an entire town. Eleanor was the first to speak, rising from her seat in the front row. I have lived half my life wondering what happened to my best friend, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Imagining her final moments, whether she suffered, whether she knew she was loved. Today I have answers, however painful. And for that, I thank you, Victor. Others followed, Catherine's former students, now adults with children of their own, colleagues from the elementary school, neighbors who had searched the woods calling her name. Each shared memories of Catherine, each acknowledged the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Thomas Blackwood spoke last, his words careful, measured. My father and brother went to their graves protecting a lie that poisoned this town for nearly 3 decades. In their misguided loyalty, they perpetuated a betrayal that began before I was born. Today, that cycle ends. He looked directly at the camera, addressing Reeves. Not with forgiveness, that's not mine to give, but with a commitment that the truth, however ugly, will never again be sacrificed for the sake of power or appearances. Victor Reeves died 3 weeks later, his confession having opened floodgates that swept away decades of carefully constructed deception. In the aftermath, Pinecrest faced painful reckonings, other secrets emerged, other abuses of power came to light. The Blackwood legacy, once synonymous with prosperity and progress, was revealed as built on exploitation and manipulation that extended far beyond Catherine's case. Yet from this upheaval, something remarkable emerged. The Catherine Mills Foundation, initially established to fund scholarships and cold case investigations, expanded its mission. Under Thomas Blackwood's guidance and with Maureen's counsel, it became a vehicle for community healing and transformation. The abandoned Holloway mine property was reclaimed and converted into a memorial park, with walking trails and quiet spaces for reflection. The spot where Catherine had been found became a small sanctuary, marked by a simple stone engraved with words from her recovered journal, "Truth is not a burden to be carried but a light to guide the way." On the 1-year anniversary of Reeves's confession, Maureen stood at the entrance to the memorial park, watching as residents gathered for a community healing ceremony. Eleanor had organized it, not as a remembrance of tragedy, but as a celebration of resilience. Children ran along newly planted paths, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Families spread blankets on fresh grass, sharing food and stories. At the center of the gathering, a small stage had been set up where former students of Catherine's were performing a play they had written about her life, not defined by her death, but by the joy and kindness she had brought to their young lives. Thomas joined Maureen, offering her a cup of coffee from the community table. "Not what I expected when I sent you that photograph a year ago," he admitted. "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered the question. "Justice, I suppose. An ending. Not this." He gestured to the gathering. "Not a new beginning." Maureen smiled slightly. "True justice is rarely about endings. It's about restoration, setting things right so that healing can begin. Is that what we've done here? Set things right?" She watched as Eleanor took the stage, introducing a scholarship recipient who would be the first in her family to attend college, a young woman whose determination and compassion reminded many of Catherine herself. "We've made a start," Maureen said. "The rest is up to them. To all of us." As the afternoon progressed, Maureen circulated through the crowd, no longer just the sheriff who had solved the case, but a member of a community in the process of redefining itself. People stopped her to share memories, not just of Catherine, but of how the truth had impacted their own lives, secrets they had finally spoken aloud, relationships they had mended, changes they had made. One elderly woman grasped Maureen's hand tightly. "I've lived in Pinecrest my whole life," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Watched the Blackwoods run this town like their private kingdom. Never thought I'd see the day when truth mattered more than power. You did that, Sheriff. You showed us it was possible." Maureen shook her head. "Catherine did that. She refused to be silenced, even in death. The rest of us just had to be brave enough to listen." As twilight descended, lanterns were lit along the paths, simple paper constructions with candles inside, each bearing the name of someone in the community who had been lost but not forgotten. Catherine's lantern led the way, a beacon at the front of a procession that wound through the park as darkness fell. Maureen watched from a distance as the lights moved like a constellation come to Earth, each person carrying their own piece of memory, their own fragment of truth. In their collective illumination, the darkness that had shrouded Pinecrest for so long couldn't stand. Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the park emptied, Maureen returned alone. She followed the path to the small sanctuary where Catherine's memorial stone stood, moonlight silvering the engraved words. From her pocket, she withdrew the faded red pin that had marked Catherine's case on her map for so many years. She knelt, pressing the pin into the soft earth beside the stone. "Case closed," she whispered. "Truly, this time." As she rose, a gentle breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the scent of new growth and fresh possibilities. Maureen took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the promise of spring, a season of renewal after the long winter of secrets. In solving Catherine Mills's case, Maureen hadn't just uncovered the truth about one woman's death. She had helped the community confront its deepest wounds, acknowledge the corrupting influence of power unchecked, and begin the difficult work of healing. Not through forgetting, but through remembering honestly. Not through denial, but through acceptance. Not through burying the past, but by bringing it into the light. She walked slowly back toward town, where windows glowed warm against the night sky. Pinecrest was changed, broken open and remade. The blackwood shadow no longer darkened its streets. The silence that had protected the powerful no longer smothered the voices of the vulnerable. In its place was something more complex, more challenging, but ultimately more alive, a community that had learned, at great cost, that truth was not a luxury but a necessity. That justice, however delayed, was worth pursuing. That one person's steadfast refusal to look away could, eventually, change everything. As Maureen reached Main Street, she paused, looking back at the park where Catherine's memory now lived not as a ghost but as an inspiration. The case that had defined her career was closed. But its impact, on her, on Pinecrest, on all whose lives it had touched, would continue to ripple outward, a reminder that even the most deeply buried truths eventually find their way to the surface. And when they do, they change the landscape forever. 5 years after Victor Reeves's confession, Pinecrest had transformed from a town defined by secrecy to a community celebrated for its commitment to truth and reconciliation. The Catherine Mills Foundation had expanded beyond its original scope, funding similar initiatives across the country and becoming a model for communities seeking to address long-buried injustices. Maureen Calloway, still serving as sheriff but now approaching retirement, stood at her office window watching autumn leaves dance across the town square. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor, "National Award announcement today. Turn on Channel 8. She switched on the small television in the corner just in time to see the broadcast begin. A national news anchor smiled into the camera. Today, the American Justice Coalition announced the recipient of its prestigious Truth and Reconciliation Award. This year's honor goes to the small Oregon town of Pinecrest, whose remarkable journey from tragedy to transformation began with the solving of a 27-year-old cold case. The screen filled with images of the memorial park, the scholarship recipients, community gatherings that had become regular events in the years since Catherine's case was resolved. The Catherine Mills case might have remained unsolved if not for the persistence of Sheriff Maureen Calloway, the anchor continued, who refused to accept partial truths or convenient narratives. Maureen turned down the volume as her phone rang. It was Thomas Blackwood. "Congratulations," he said when she answered. "Though I suspect you're hiding from the attention." She smiled despite herself. "Just doing my job. That's not what the Justice Coalition thinks. Or what I think." His voice grew serious. "I'm calling because there's something I want to discuss with you. Something important. Can you meet me at the Foundation office this afternoon?" The Catherine Mills Foundation headquarters occupied a modest building on Main Street, its glass-fronted entrance displaying photographs of scholarship recipients and community projects. Inside, the walls were lined with framed newspaper articles chronicling the town's journey since the case was solved, along with artwork created by local students reflecting on themes of truth, justice, and healing. Thomas greeted Maureen in the conference room, where Eleanor and several Foundation board members were already gathered. A large folder sat at the center of the table. "What's this about?" Maureen asked, noting the anticipation in their expressions. Thomas pushed the folder toward her. Open it. Inside was a formal proposal titled the Calloway Initiative for Cold Case Resolution. The document outlined a comprehensive program that would provide resources, training, and support for law enforcement agencies across the country working to solve long-dormant cases. We want to take what you accomplished with Catherine's case and make it a national model, Thomas explained. Not just solving individual cases, but using them as catalysts for community healing. Eleanor leaned forward. The foundation has secured funding for the first 5 years. We've already had interest from 12 police departments in 3 states. Maureen studied the proposal, momentarily speechless. This is extensive. And it needs a director, Thomas said, watching her carefully. Someone with first-hand experience, someone who understands that true justice goes beyond arrests and convictions. She looked up sharply. Me? You're retiring next year, Eleanor reminded her gently. Think of this as a second act. A chance to help other communities find the kind of resolution Pinecrest found. Maureen's mind raced. The proposal was thoughtful, comprehensive, aligned with everything she believed about justice and community. But it would mean stepping into a national spotlight, becoming the face of an initiative that would inevitably draw scrutiny and skepticism. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Thomas nodded. Take all the time you need. But there's one more thing you should see before you decide. He led Maureen and Eleanor to a sleek black SUV waiting outside. As they drove through town, Maureen noticed small changes that had accumulated over the years, new businesses where once empty storefronts had stood, community gardens in formerly vacant lots, murals depicting local history that didn't shy away from difficult truths. They pulled up to Pinecrest High School, where students were gathering on the front lawn around a veiled structure. Thomas guided them to reserved seats in the front row just as the principal approached the microphone. Today, we dedicate not just a memorial, but a promise, the principal began. A promise that the pursuit of truth, no matter how difficult, will always be valued in our community. She gestured to the veiled structure. 5 years ago, our school launched a special history project, asking students to research untold stories from Pinecrest's past. What began as a classroom assignment evolved into a community-wide effort to reckon with our history, all of it, not just the parts that make us comfortable. At her signal, 2 students pulled away the covering to reveal a striking sculpture, a young woman holding a lantern, her face serene and determined, standing atop a base inscribed with names, dozens of them, flowing around the circumference. This memorial honors those whose stories were silenced, the principal continued. From Catherine Mills, whose case began our journey of reconciliation, to workers who died in unsafe conditions at the Blackwood mines, to indigenous people displaced from these lands, to victims of domestic violence whose abusers were protected by those in power. She turned toward Maureen. And it stands as a testament to what can happen when one person refuses to accept that some truths must remain buried. Sheriff Calloway, would you do us the honor of lighting the lantern? Caught off guard, Maureen hesitated before rising. As she approached the sculpture, she noticed details that took her breath away. The young woman's face, while not an exact portrait, carried echoes of Catherine Mills, the same determined expression, the same spark of life. At the base of the statue was a small bronze plaque, "Truth illuminates the path to justice. Justice creates the foundation for healing. Healing allows us to move forward together." A student handed her a ceremonial lighter. Maureen reached up to the lantern, which was designed to hold an eternal flame. As she lit it, applause erupted from the gathered crowd. When she returned to her seat, Eleanor squeezed her hand. Catherine would be proud, she whispered. Not just of what you did for her, but of what you helped this town become. Thomas leaned in from her other side. That's what the initiative is about, Maureen. Not just closing cases, but opening possibilities. The ceremony concluded with a performance by the school choir, a song composed by a student, its lyrics drawn from Catherine's recovered journal. As the young voices filled the air with hope and determination, Maureen made her decision. The following morning, she called Thomas to accept the position. 6 months later, after a modest retirement ceremony from the sheriff's office, she officially began her role as director of the Calloway Initiative. The transition wasn't seamless. Despite her experience, Maureen found herself navigating unfamiliar territory, media interviews, conferences, meetings with officials from jurisdictions across the country. She had never been comfortable in the spotlight, preferring the methodical work of investigation to the performance of public speaking. But she discovered an unexpected gift for connecting with others who shared her passion for justice, particularly families of victims in unresolved cases, who found in her a genuinely empathetic advocate who understood the importance of both closure and continued remembrance. The initiative's first major success came 8 months after its launch. A small town in Michigan, struggling with the unsolved murders of 3 young women in the 1980s, invited the Calloway team to review the cold case. Using the methodologies developed in Pinecrest, they helped local law enforcement identify overlooked connections between the victims and a respected community leader who had died a decade earlier. The evidence wasn't strong enough for posthumous charges, but it was sufficient to provide answers to the victims' families. More importantly, it exposed a pattern of protection that had allowed the perpetrator to escape justice. Several officials had suppressed evidence due to the suspect's standing in the community. As in Pinecrest, the revelation sparked a painful but necessary reckoning. The town established its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, addressing not just these specific crimes but the culture that had enabled them. The process wasn't easy. There was resistance, denial, anger. But gradually, healing began. This pattern repeated as the initiative took on more cases. Sometimes they found definitive answers. Sometimes they uncovered partial truths. Sometimes they could only provide a framework for communities to confront unresolved questions. But wherever they went, they left behind tools for transformation, not just the technical resources for solving cold cases, but the understanding that true healing required honest acknowledgement of past failures and collective commitment to a more just future. 3 years into the initiative, Maureen found herself back in Pinecrest for the annual Catherine Mills Memorial Gathering. What had begun as a solemn observance had evolved into a community festival celebrating resilience and growth. The memorial park was filled with families enjoying picnics on the grass, children participating in art projects, community groups showcasing their work. A small stage featured performances by local musicians, including several songs written specifically about Catherine and the town's journey since her case was solved. Eleanor, now the foundation's executive director, joined Maureen as she watched the festivities from a quiet bench overlooking the central meadow. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is the same town," Eleanor said. "When Catherine disappeared, it was like a shadow fell over everything. No one trusted anyone. Everyone had secrets." Maureen nodded. "The truth doesn't just solve cases. It changes communities." "That should be your next book title," Eleanor teased, referring to the memoir Maureen had reluctantly agreed to write after much persuasion from the foundation board. "I'm still not convinced anyone will want to read it." Eleanor gave her a skeptical look. "The initiative has been adopted in 43 jurisdictions across 12 states. You've helped solve or provide resolution to 27 cold cases. The Justice Department is using your methodology as a model for community-centered approaches to cold case investigation. People are interested, Maureen." Before she could respond, they were joined by a young woman, one of the initiative's first scholarship recipients, now a promising law student. "Sheriff Calloway. I was hoping to find you here." Maureen smiled. "Ava. How's law school treating you?" "Challenging in all the best ways." She sat beside them. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said when I started, that justice is a process, not a moment. I'm beginning to understand what that means." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Blackwood, accompanied by an unfamiliar man in a well-tailored suit. Thomas made the introductions. "Maureen, Eleanor, Ava, this is Congressman Robert Martinez. He's on the House Judiciary Committee and has been following our work." The congressman extended his hand. "Sheriff Calloway, it's an honor." I've been studying your initiative as part of proposed legislation to establish a national cold case review board with a specific focus on community impact and restoration. He explained his vision, a federally funded program that would expand the Calloway Initiative's approach nationwide, providing resources for law enforcement agencies to revisit unsolved cases while simultaneously supporting communities in addressing the underlying conditions that allowed injustice to persist. We'd like you to testify before the committee, he concluded. Share your experiences, help shape the legislation. Maureen's initial instinct was to decline. She had never sought the national stage, had never wanted to become the face of a movement. But as she looked around at the gathering, at the community that had been transformed by truth, at the young people who were carrying that transformation forward, she recognized her responsibility. I'd be honored, she said simply. The legislation, eventually known as the Cold Case Justice and Community Restoration Act, passed with bipartisan support the following year. Its implementation wasn't without challenges, bureaucratic hurdles, resistance from agencies reluctant to revisit past failures, limited resources stretched across enormous need. But its impact was undeniable. Across the country, communities began confronting long-buried secrets, acknowledging systematic failures, and working toward meaningful change. Cold cases were being solved, yes, but more importantly, the wounds they had left behind were finally receiving the attention needed to heal. 5 years to the day after her retirement as sheriff, Maureen stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center. The occasion was the formal launch of the National Center for Cold Case Justice, a research and training facility that would serve as the permanent home for the methodologies and approaches pioneered by the Calloway Initiative. As she addressed the audience, law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, community organizers, students preparing to enter these fields, Maureen reflected on the journey that had brought her here. I didn't set out to create a model or launch a movement, she told them. I simply believe that a young woman who disappeared deserved more than convenient half-truths and comfortable silence. I believe that her community deserved to know what had happened, even if that knowledge was painful. And I discovered that truth, however difficult, creates possibilities that secrets never can. She looked out at the assembled faces, particularly the younger ones who would carry this work forward. Cold cases aren't just about what happened in the past. They're about who we choose to be in the present. Every unsolved murder, every unexplained disappearance, every unanswered question leaves a wound that affects not just the immediate victims and their loved ones, but entire communities. Maureen gestured to the photographs projected behind her, images from Pinecrest and other communities that had undergone similar transformations. These places aren't just solving old crimes. They're reimagining justice itself, not as punishment delivered, but as truth acknowledged, harm recognized, and healing made possible. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled at a reception in the center's newly dedicated Catherine Mills Library, Thomas approached Maureen with a small package. A gift, he said, for the woman who changed everything. Inside was a lantern, miniature but exquisitely crafted, an exact replica of the one atop the memorial statue in Pinecrest. It lights up, Thomas explained, demonstrating the small switch at its base. The tiny flame glowed with surprising brightness. To remind you that one light, however small, can illuminate what seemed lost forever. Maureen held the lantern carefully, watching its glow reflect in the polished surfaces around them. It was never just my light, she said quietly. It was Catherine's determination, Eleanor's loyalty, your courage to face the truth about your family. It was an entire town eventually choosing truth over comfort. Thomas nodded. But someone had to strike the first match. Later that evening, in the quiet of her hotel room, Maureen placed the lantern on the windowsill. Its light cast a gentle glow across the room, creating a circle of warmth in the darkness. She thought of Catherine Mills, no longer defined by her disappearance and death, but remembered for how her story had ultimately brought light to so many lives. She thought of Pinecrest, no longer a town shadowed by secrets, but a community that had found the courage to face its past honestly and create a more just present. She thought of the many other communities now following similar paths, each finding their own way toward truth and reconciliation. And she thought of herself, not the reluctant sheriff who had once hesitated to disturb comfortable silences, but the woman who had discovered that true justice required not just solving cases, but transforming the conditions that allowed injustice to flourish. As she prepared for bed, Maureen left the lantern glowing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking guidance, new opportunities to spread the understanding that had begun with one cold case in a small Oregon town. The work wasn't easy, truth rarely was, but its rewards were immeasurable. For every cold case solved, lives were changed. For every long-buried secret brought to light, healing became possible. For every community that found the courage to confront its past honestly, a more just future opened before them. And in that knowledge, Maureen found a peace she had never expected when she first opened that manila envelope containing a Polaroid photograph and 5 words that had changed everything: "I know who killed her." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.